Welcome to the Web-Based Visualization Lecture, part of the Principles of Data Visualization lecture series. Now, where we'll start today, we'll take a look at a wonderful example of web-based data visualization that has been called the OECD Better Life Index. It is a project that created and completed by Moritz Stefaner, as well as a team of data visualization folks. And basically what it does is it compares the quality of life in different countries across the globe. So we'll take a look at it. I'll point out some of the different aspects of data visualization and coding. I'll ask a couple questions of you guys to see if some of the techniques look familiar. And then we'll proceed into some of the concepts in web-based data visualization. So here we have the online interactive application called the Better Life Index. And what it is a comparison of what it's like to live in different countries based on a number of different factors. So we start off, we'll take a look at a particular scale. So each of these factors is scaled. You can see we have the labels of different countries. And then we have a number of different factors. So those factors are how is housing? How is income? So can you earn income in that country? Can you get a job? What's community like there? How is education? The environment, civic engagement, health, life satisfaction, are people that are generally satisfied with their life, safety, and work-life balance. And we'll see each of these factors encoded as a particular leaf. Now, I'm curious if any of these, if this particular type of design looks familiar. What type of diagram or data visualization you may have seen before that's similar to this. And think about what type of data visualizations work on a radius. So some of you may have guessed, hey, maybe that's a pie chart, which would be a good guess. A pie chart does in fact work on a radius, but in this case, this isn't necessarily borrowing from the pie chart. It is borrowing from the coxcomb diagram. So if you remember, the Florence Nightingale examples worked on a radius, as this data visualization also works on a radius. And for different months in the Florence Nightingale diagrams, there were different measures of what the particular cause of death may have been. In this case, utilizing some of the same design and style and principles, each of these factors is a unique leaf that has different length to it. So just like the coxcomb diagram, it projects out from the center and has varying degrees based on the index in that particular country. Now, let's head toward using this particular data visualization. How does this thing work? So what we can do is we can go over and use the sliders on each of these indexes. Let's say there are certain things that we care a whole lot about. So let's be honest. We all care a lot about income, particularly here in the School of Management. We also care a lot about getting a job. And notice that when we change these factors and we provide greater weighting, it highlights those particular indexes, and then it fades back the ones that we haven't highlighted. Now, perhaps there's some other factors that we might be interested in. Perhaps we're very interested in the environment. That might change our picture. Maybe we're very interested in safety. And maybe we've decided I'd like a good work-life balance. Okay, so here we've placed a lot of emphasis on income, jobs, work-life balance, and we've left the other factors at a somewhat minimum level. Then we can take a look at, well, who might excel? A country that might be a good place for those particular aspects. So we look here, it looks like perhaps Denmark, but maybe slightly less, Norway, Switzerland, and the United States all excel in these particular factors. Now we might decide to explore one at a more detailed level. So we've now gone from the overview where we had a comparison, and we're now looking at details on demand. So how is life? There's a whole conversation about what it's like to live in the United States. We can take a look at different topics, as well as the comparables. So we can compare on particular aspects that we find most interesting. And one of the areas that the U.S. tends to excel at is income, probably given the reason, one of the strongest reasons for our overall performance of the U.S. In our selection. Now, jobs, that varies some. So we find, particularly in some of the European countries, they might perform a little better on jobs. And we can also explore different aspects. So let's say generally on education. Perhaps like me, thinking about or have children. So you might want to take a look at that as a factor. And there may be some other countries that perform much better than the U.S. So some standout examples recently you'll find in the press and academic literature, both Finland as well as South Korea, which are reflected here in these ratings. And we talked about work-life balance. And you'll notice on this one, the United States isn't such a strong performer here. There are a whole bunch of countries that perform much better. For example, Netherlands, Denmark, France, Sweden, etc. So depending on what we're interested in, what focus we place on these different indexes might provide us with a different outcome. And there are a few sort of fun facts to know. What's the population in the U.S.? This would be true for any country that we decided to select. So let's say we go back. We might be able to locate. So I think we had the example of Finland performed very well with academics, with education. So we might come back and take a look at how Finland performed if we decided some of our perspective was a little bit different. And there, sure enough, is Finland showing up performing very high in education. but maybe not so strong in income. Okay. So all of this is performed using web-based data visualization. It's all running with different visualization, data visualization web classes like SVG and D3. So I encourage you guys to explore it, refer back to it. As well, this is a good example of the state-of-the-art, probably one of the best web-based data visualizations that's been built in recent history. So feel free to use it as a benchmark and an example. Really wonderful, excellent example of web-based data visualization. Now let's discuss some of the building blocks for creating web-based data visualization. So the most basic one, the most fundamental one, is HTML. So we're going to be creating different examples of code, different code examples using an overall framework of HTML. Within it, we're going to utilize cascading style sheets. So we may want to use some CSS to format different types of objects. We're going to use a technology called SVG. So SVG is a class, a development class that provides unique shapes, basically helps us define shapes that we'll utilize in our data visualization. We'll use JavaScript for some of our interactivity. Then we'll discuss D3. So D3 is going to be our primary data visualization class that we'll use. And finally, we'll wrap up discussing GitHub, which is an online resource where we can go to and look for code examples, as well as saving our data sets and code examples under our name. Now, in order to do some of our web-based data visualization, we're going to need to create our own personal web server. And we provided instructions for you guys to either install a WAMP server. So this is a personal web server on the Windows platform. And if you happen to be using an OS X operating system, the equivalent is called MAMP. Both built by the same organization. They're open source tools. They're very solid utilities, programs that we can use. And what they do is they help us display our web pages as we're developing them. We can display our web pages in the browser without having any kind of issues. We can see how those web pages might run on a web server because this will be our own little mini version of a web server running on our own machine. So we'll need to install one of those packages. You'll also need to choose a text editor. Now, the type of text editor that you choose will be up to you. We've provided Eclipse, example of a professional grade text editor. So Eclipse is used in lots of different development scenarios. That's an option for you. A lot of students choose Notepad++. It's available on the Windows platform. It's fairly simple to use. So a lot of folks prefer this. My preference is for Sublime. I recommend this as a text editor. It has lots of nice features in it that highlight with color coding different aspects of your code, which I find pleasing. There's also Brackets, Text Wrangler, and probably several other examples of text editors. So these would be the short list of recommendations for choosing a text editor. You can use anything you like as long as it can perform text editing. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that we're going to be constructing code examples in an HTML framework. So we're going to have HTML pages as our code base. With HTML, we have different sections of the code. We're going to walk through some of these with you. just so you get a feel of, okay, what is HTML? We all get on the same page of what some of these tags are and just get comfortable with what we're looking at. So the first tag that we want to look at is the head. So this is where we'll find identification information about this particular web page. And so if we look over in the screen capture on the right, it's called HTML document, and you'll see in line 3 the tag that says head, and then you'll also see the ending or the closing of the head in row 6. And then basically you'll see in 4 and 5 we define the character set and then the title of this particular page, which we've just called HTML exercise for simplicity. We could type anything here. So you could call it my favorite start project. HTML is great. I love HTML. Whatever your preference is here, you could title it, and the title goes in the head. As we just discussed, the title is the title of the page, so you'll see the tags in row 5 there for title, begins, then whatever we type in text, and then the ending tag for the title. So whatever I type in between those two tags is what will be displayed as the title. Which brings us to the body. So the body of the HTML page starts on row 8. We have a number of different tags or statements that we have in the body. So the body is going to be the working area of whatever code we're going to write. We might look at the H1 and H2 tags, and we'll see there in H1, welcome to data visualization course. We have some different formatting aspects there. We've done some bold. If we look at the H2 tag, we've defined the HTML page dash the student name. So this provides you for a nice place to put your name when you're creating your code, so that we know it's yours. And it also provides a nice verification when you perform a screen capture here. So the new paragraph of the text, so you'll see several places where we have a tag of P. So with that P is basically a new paragraph. So we open the paragraph and then you'll see a little bit later the closing of the paragraph. So a good example of that is if we look at row 18, we open the paragraph with the tag. We have what we've called an unordered list. We create that unordered list with just some items like list 1, list 2, list 3, and then we close the paragraph in row 24. So this gives you a little bit of an overview of the different areas or sections of an HTML page. We can add new paragraphs of text, so we might have another paragraph that we added in row 26 called an ordered list. We have list 1, 2, and 3 again. And basically the unordered list, so what you see there in row 19, that UL is a tag that basically says make some bullet points. So what it's going to do in front of list 1, 2, and 3, it's going to put a bullet point in front of each of those that's being driven by that UL tag. If I have an OL tag, basically it will be an ordered list, also known as a numbered list. So in front of list 1, list 2, and list 3, it will have basically a number that's defined before it. And so that's what our OL tag performs. Now let's take a look at this code example. So here we've opened up a text editor. So we've opened up Sublime. This is my text editor preference, but you can choose anything that you prefer. I've brought in a file, a piece of code that we were looking at before. Basically just opened it up, and of course you could, as appropriate, open up a particular file and bring it into your own text editor. Some of the highlights that we're looking at, so this is in the tab in my text editor in Sublime here. It will define the name of the file, and we'll see that across the top in the different tabs. Sort of a reminder on some of the, or re-review of some of the important areas. So we have our head for our piece of HTML code. We have the title goes within the head, and so I can create whatever title I would like for this to be. Then we have the body, so we open up the body section, which will be our working area. This is where we close the body section, and then we can perform lots of work within it. And we've got some simple work that we've done here. This is a header tag where basically we put some text in here. This is just a statement, welcome to the data visualization course. Another statement from the H2 tag, HTML page, student name. And we've got some different paragraphs, paragraph open, paragraph closed. So we put some text in here. Here's our unordered list, basically of bullet points. This defines our bullet points. And then our ordered list that defines our numbering of these. Then we close it out. So this should just give you a simple example of an HTML document. We will begin to add some other features and classes and functions as we progress through the different concepts of web-based data visualization. The second major technology that we'll be utilizing is called Cascading Style Sheets, or CSS. So CSS defines how HTML elements are displayed. So it'll apply styles by sheet, basically a template instead of an individual tag. So what we were looking at before, we were just doing things with tags. We'd open a tag, we might write some text, we might put another tag that says put this text in bold, and so we're doing it sort of one piece at a time. What CSS allows us to do is apply an entire template utilizing what's called a selector. So in this example that we have, our selector is H1, and then we have a number of declarations that go with that selector. So anytime we provide the H1 selector, it's going to define the color of blue and the font size of 12 here. Basically, those two declarations of style, anytime we code H1, will be applied. So anytime we declare this in the code, we hit H1, we make that available in the code, the style properties will then be applied. Now, we want to talk a little bit about applying height and width. So, predominantly, when we're looking at our HTML document, we may have a particular viewing section, and we want to adjust the pixel size of that height and width. And to do that, we're going to adjust the minimum and maximum parameters. So as an example, we might see here, we have a particular style. The height on this style is 425 pixels. The width is 450 pixels. And then we've also got some parameters that we can apply that are maximum height and minimum height, maximum width, and minimum width. And then the background color of yellow. So what this allows us to do, particularly the max height and min height, is basically set constraints on what we're viewing here. In this case, we're just viewing the viewable area. So we've set the height to 425 pixels. which is easily less than our max height, so that it won't be constrained by our max height. Our minimum height will be 400 pixels. So in this case, 425 is greater than 400, so there's no issue there. However, we could change our height to 375 pixels and then leave the min height parameter the same. Now, if we've done that, what's going to happen in our viewable area, our viewable result, is we're actually going to see a viewable area of 400 pixels. Even though we set the height to 375 pixels, the parameter of minimum height at 400 is greater than that, so it's going to apply the minimum height, and so it will always be 400 pixels or greater than, but it won't allow the viewable area to be less than 400 pixels. And the same thing holds true with the width. So here we have a maximum width of 500. The width that we've defined is 450 pixels. The minimum width is 300 pixels, so it fits very nicely there. If we were to reduce the width to 275 pixels, the viewable image would still be displayed 300 pixels wide because the minimum width requires that. We've set that parameter. And then as well, we have a background color of yellow. We're basically just defining this in our code here. If we wanted to change that color, we could certainly do that within our style paragraph here. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So here we have an example of some style formatting. We have basically our HTML code, some styles defined here, and then this is the result of this code. So if we run this code, we will see basically the creation of this yellow box. So background color is yellow, the height 325 pixels, the width is 350 pixels. If we wanted to adjust that some, we could adjust it. So a little bit less height there and a little bit less width. And then perhaps we want to adjust this to a nice UT Dallas orange. So what we've done is we basically defined the height and the width and the background color of orange. Now I want to focus in as well on this max and min height and max and min width. So what these are parameters that basically constrain what we're looking at. And they're sort of like guardrails that keep us within a particular viewing area. And I'll show you what I mean by this. So first, we'll take a look at going underneath our minimum height. So our minimum height is set at 200. And I'm going to adjust this to less than 200. So what's happened here is we define the height to be 100, but we also have a parameter that says the minimum height is 200. So when it defined this particular viewing object, it took the minimum height parameter instead of the height parameter, because this is min height, and it made it 200. And just to illustrate, you'll see nothing changed there. But if I go to 210, you should see a slight increase there. Okay? Now we can also do the same thing with width. So our width is set at 300. We can make adjustments on our width. So that will make an adjustment. That width, 310, is between our minimum width of 200 and 400. So we don't have any issue there. And we can continue to increase the size. And it will increase the size until we get to 400 pixels. And at 400 pixels of width, we have a max width of 400, and that will constrain whatever value we put in width, and it won't allow us to get any wider than that. So let's go ahead and take it up to 390. Still good there. But if we go to 410, it's now being constrained by the 400 pixels. And you will be able to see that when I enter 400 pixels, you'll see no change there. Okay. I could go up to 500 pixels, still no change. And in order to get any larger, any more width, I will have to expand the max width so that it can get wider. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a feel for applying some style parameters. Here we're just defining the minimum and maximum height and width of an element, just a little bit formatting here of style with the background color on that viewable area. Now we'll take a look at linking a CSS style sheet. So as we discussed, instead of just applying a single style parameter, we can apply a style sheet that may have several different parameters in it. And so if you look in row 6, we have a link there in the head that we've defined a style sheet. We've defined the type is text CSS, and then we've provided the name of that particular style sheet. So now we'll take a look at the actual code that looks like this. So here we've now opened up our CSS, our HTML and CSS link to our style sheet. So if we look in row 6, we've added a link to style sheet. We've defined the type, and we've defined the particular name of that style sheet. That will be connected to a file that we have in the same directory as this HTML page, and that particular piece of code, that particular file will be called capital CSS _ capital S stylesheet.css. And so the styles will be retained, basically formatted in that style sheet, and we'll be bringing those in our code link here. So here we have our browser window. We've simply just opened a tab in Chrome, and now we're going to take our piece of code that linked to a style sheet, and we're going to drag it in to our browser. And when we do, that code will engage the style sheet and apply the style sheet. So here we've drug in that same piece of code that we were looking at, and it applied a particular style to our text. It created this colored background as well as changed the colors of our ordered lists. So now we need to talk about SVG, which is an acronym, Scalable Vector Graphics. So with Scalable Vector Graphics, this is a particular library that we're going to utilize that helps us shift from pixel-based images, pixel-based shapes, to what are called vector using an algorithm. So back when we were making adjustments to our yellow and our orange box, we were doing that with pixel measurements. So if you recall, I was adjusting like 200 px, so the px stands for pixels. I might adjust it to 300 px. So basically we're adjusting the pixel count from 200 to 300. And we were drawing shapes utilizing those specifications in pixels. With SVG, we're going to change the way we specify the creation of different objects, particularly graphics objects. So SVG, the SVG library, is based on shapes versus pixels. So we're going to be utilizing this vector algorithm. We're going to define different types of shapes, and it's going to apply that algorithm to create or draw the shapes for us. Now, the main improvement, and it's a substantial improvement, something that works very, very well, when we use the SVG library, is it maintains very high quality when the screen is resized. So let's say that you resize your screen. We're using SVG. It very accurately and sharply redraws that image based on the new screen size. And that's where we get the scalable aspect. So whether I have a small screen or a large screen, I'm able to rescale that object size using an algorithm instead of having sort of hard-coded pixel definitions that aren't going to be as sharp and may not scale nearly as well. Now this allows storage as a shape versus pixel information. So basically what we're doing with the SVG library is whenever we want to draw a particular object, we're defining that shape. And from that definition of shape, the SVG library knows how to render or draw that particular object because we've created that as a definition. So when we're creating an SVG element, so this is an example of creating basically a bar, a horizontal bar. And I'd like for you guys to think about this is a bar in a bar chart. So it's horizontal, runs across with SVG width. Basically, when we define the SVG width, you'll see this underneath the header that says edit this code. So if we look in the box on the left, our SVG width here is 400 and our height is 180. Now what that is defining, what the statement SVG width is defining is basically the canvas that we can draw on. So we can draw on a canvas that is 400 wide and 180 high. Now we haven't drawn anything on it yet. It just this defines how big our canvas is. Only after we've defined that SVG width can we then come back and say, okay, now we want to create an object. So we're going to create this object called a rectangle. So RECT is the object definition in the SVG library. And what we're defining is a rectangle. So on the X, basically the X location of 50. So think about that as the X-axis. And if we look over on the right-hand side in the result, you'll notice that the beginning of our bar starts basically a space in, a measure of 50 in from the left-hand side. And then Y, on the Y, we're basically 20 down from the top. So if we were at the 0, 0 position, we would be in the top left-hand corner, starting in the top left-hand corner. That's the 0, 0 position. But we've decided we want to create this rectangle 50 in on the X and 20 down on the Y. Then we define the width. So the width is 350, so that is basically how wide this bar is going to be. So it's a fairly wide bar we see there from left to right. So we've defined it with that 350. And then the height is going to be a 20. So that's sort of the height or thickness of our bar here. Then we have the style. So we've defined the style as fill this bar as blue. The stroke is what is defining the line on the outside of that rectangle. So we've defined that we want the line on the outside of it to be black. We could have defined it as another color. If you prefer yellow or pink, by all means, you could change it to that. Different shades of gray, whatever your preference is. And then the stroke width is basically how thick that outside line is that goes around the bar. Opacity, so we can adjust the opacity of the object. Basically, do we have 100% of the color or only half of the color of the object coming through? Now, as we decide to create a bar for a chart, a couple of things to highlight here. So again, we've defined the SVG width, 400 by 180 is the canvas, so that's what we can draw on. And then our X and Y starting location is going to be the 50 and 20. So we basically come over 50, come down 20, and that's where we're going to begin our bar. The width is the left to right, so that's the 350. And then the height, top to bottom, that's the 20. And then the style are the specifications on filling that particular space. So in the statement that is for the rectangle that begins with the RECT, all we've really done is specify what that shape's going to be. But it would in essence be, without the style, it would basically be invisible. We wouldn't be able to see it. But once we've added the style, that's where it fills in the blue, puts a black line around the outside, finds how wide the black line around the outside is going to be, and whether that particular color is full intensity or slightly opaque. Now the SVG library works off of a set of basic shapes, and these are the basic shapes that SVG works with. First, we have a polygon. Now we've defined a three-sided polygon here known as a triangle, but we could also have a six-sided hexagon, an eight-sided octagon, so lots of different applications of polygon. We can have a line. So basically, point A to point B, define a line. We can have what's called a polyline. So with a polyline, it has different segments in it. And we define those different segments of a polyline in pretty much the same way we do with a line. We just give different coordinates to draw the polyline through. We have a rectangle. So just like we've been discussing, we can define a rectangle, a circle, and then an ellipse. And from each of those types of shapes, we can typically construct just about any type of visual image that we'd like to see. Now, here's an overview of a whole set of SVG shapes, and we will define the syntax of those shapes as we go. So we're going to be discussing the shapes that are drawn in the image in the center of the screen here. Probably you see an X and a Y, basically a grid, and then you'll see a green rectangle, you see an orange circle, blue line, red polyline. So we're going to be discussing what the syntax of creating those is. So now let's look down at the code example and we'll walk through the syntax of creating each of these. So first you'll see here we've engaged SVG. So we've taken a look at this particular library. of SVG. We've connected to it, and now we're going to define some of these shapes. So the first one we'll define is the rectangle. So that's described RECT. We'll provide an X and a Y coordinate to begin this. And so if you look at the X, so that runs horizontal across the top there. It looks like we've come about halfway across between 0 and 50, which is what we've specified there. So an X of 25. And the same thing on the Y. So the Y runs vertically. We've come down about halfway between the 0 and the 50 on the Y-axis, basically starting at 25. So we're starting at a position of this rectangle at 25, 25. Then we'll have a width of 200. And so if we look across, if we started on the 25 and a width of 200, the furthest right corner, our rectangle, is at 225, which would make sense. That's the 25 plus 200. And then similarly on the height, we started at 25, we went down 200 of height, and the bottom left-hand corner of our rectangle is at the 225 position on the Y. Now our fill, we've decided to fill it with lime. Lime's basically a color, and we could change the color there if we would like to. The stroke width is 4. So remember, the stroke is the line on the outside of the shape, and you can probably best identify it when I say that that line is pink. So the stroke width is 4, the color's pink, and now you can probably see that we've drawn a pink line around the outside of our lime green rectangle. Now proceeding to the next shape, the circle. So with the circle, we're going to start at 2 particular points. So you'll see we have our CX and our CY, and those are our center points for X and Y. So with X, we read over 125 on the X-axis. So we find our position there, and then we read down 125 on the Y-axis. And so we start with the center point of 125, 125 is the center of the circle. Our radius is 75, so just like our radius works, it extends out 75 from the center, and then we're going to fill it with orange. So we've defined our fill color there as orange. And we can draw our circle. Now let's take a look at the polyline. So the polyline is formed as a number of different line segments. So we'll start, the polyline starts reading over at the X position of 50. So we see, if we look at the X position of 50, that's where the very beginning of the red line starts, at the over position of X, 50, and the down position of 150 on the Y. Then the end, or the next, the end of that first segment is going to be at 5200. So I read over at 50, and then I read down to 200, and you'll see that now draws that first little segment of the red line, that first little vertical segment. Then my next coordinate is at 200, 200. So if I read over on the X to 200, read down on the Y to 200, and I look, and that is the end point of the next segment, so the second little segment in our polyline. And then my final coordinate is at 200, 100, so I read over 200 on the X and down 100 on the Y, and that creates the final segment of our polyline. Now, we want to see our polyline, so we have to give our stroke color. In this case, we gave it a color of red. Stroke width we defined as 4, and we didn't have any fill. So there's no requirement of filling the polyline here. Now the last shape that we'll draw is the line. And this one basically has a beginning and an ending set of coordinates. So The beginning coordinates are the x1 here. So the x1 is at 50 and the y1 is at 50. So that's the beginning coordinate of the line. And then the ending coordinate of the line is at x2 at 200 and y2, 200. And so we've now provided a specification for that line from 50, 50 to 200, 200. When we provide the stroke color of blue, it now creates a blue line with a stroke width of 4. Okay? So this is a good overview. Each of the different shapes we can create in SVG. We can also have color adjustments in SVG. Now we've already been through here in the body of this particular code example. We know what the SVG width is. It defines a canvas for us. We know what the rectangle width and height is. That basically defines a particular rectangle. But one of the things that we haven't reviewed in detail is how we define color. Now, so far, up to this point, we've just defined color using a word. So we've used orange, we've used yellow, we've used blue, I think we've used pink, lime, several different colors basically in name. But what we're going to do here is utilize this capability in SVG called RGB. And RGB is a set of specifications that's based on the amount of red, green, and blue that we allow through a filter. And if you will remember back to our discussion on what is color encoding in our discussion of the color variable in Bertin's principles, you'll recall that color worked on how much we're filtering. And that's how this RGB coloration approach works. So RGB works in this way. We have RGB, then we open parentheses. We have the parameter from 0 to 255 for red. Then the parameter, the second parameter will be from 0 to 255, that is green. And then the comma, and then the third parameter is from 0 to 255, which is blue. And so our notation here is RGB, open parentheses, whatever setting for R, comma, whatever setting for green, comma, and whatever setting for blue, and then close parentheses. Now, I've highlighted for you down at the bottom of the screen. If I want red, I would have the setting RGB, then the maximum value for the red setting of 255, and then I would have the minimum setting of 0 for both green and blue, and that would give me pure red. The second one, so here I want the setting to be green, so I'll take the RGB of 0, comma, and then the max setting for green of 255, and then comma 0, close parentheses. And so I've max setting of green, I've left red and blue at 0, and so I'll get pure green. And then the last one for blue, RGB, open parentheses, the minimum setting for red, comma, minimum setting for green, comma, and then the maximum setting for blue, close parentheses, and that will give me pure blue. So this is the way the RGB color adjustments work. What I can do is I can take these three different values and I can set them at different levels. So 100, 100, and 100 will give me a particular color, different color than 50, 50, and 50, which is different combinations of filtering out red, green, and blue to give me an alternative color. And so now we'll take a quick look at applying those different RGB values. So now let's take a look at how we apply some of our RGB. So using our example, here's our HTML, our SVG, width and height, basically the canvas that we can draw on. We've drawn a rectangle, so the width is 300, height is 100. If we wanted to reduce that height down, we can. If we want to take it even further, make it look like a bar chart. So there's our bar. And then we get to the style. So we have the style fill RGB for our rectangle. And remember, this is red, green, and blue. And we have the maximum value for blue that you see it filling in here. Okay. So if we wanted to turn that into a red line or a red bar, we would simply change our definition of red, green, blue. Now you might notice as well that we have a stroke, which is the line on the outside, and we've defined that to green. Perhaps we want to change that to blue. And then we can also make adjustments anywhere in between the 0 and 255 on all three of the parameters. And I think we discussed perhaps we would have some of each. So that has changed the definition of our color there, and perhaps the stroke as well. So we've created a slightly different coloration, and we can certainly make adjustments to the red, the green, and the blue. Now we'll discuss JavaScript as a component that will assist us with our data visualization work. So JavaScript is a technology, and essentially it provides event-driven capabilities to adjust elements. And you can think about it as JavaScript is sort of my code library to make things actionable. So if I click on a button, something will happen. If I click on a different button, something different will happen. And so that's where we're getting this event driven. The event is clicking on the button, and then the elements that are appropriate are adjusted from clicking on that button. And what JavaScript also does is it provides us with the ability to store variables that we'd like to use. And so what we've provided here is a small code snippet of JavaScript. It starts out there at the top. We define its HTML. This is the body section. We can see it's going to have a header of an example of JavaScript defined in the body, which you can see the result over on the right-hand side. And then we have another line of text that is a paragraph. And then we have a button. So we've defined this button called try it. And then we're going to basically run our script, our JavaScript there. And we're going to assign a function. So here it's just simply called my function. And it's going to get this particular element. And then it's going to change the text when we click this button. So let's go take a look at that. Okay, now we're here in front of our code example, our HTML example. We've got some JavaScript code here. We've got our particular script, and from here we're going to basically show what JavaScript can do, how it can change. So just as a reminder, this is what JavaScript can do. So here's our title. So JavaScript can change the HTML content. We have a particular type of button. And when we click on it, it might say, "Hello JavaScript." And so see how it's changed to whatever has been defined in this particular click definition for the scripting function. So we could change it a little bit, and let's refresh. And there we go. It's changing it from the button there after we refresh the code. We could also make some adjustments here if we wanted to. And it works in this way. So JavaScript is basically this library that allows us to have these particular functions, and if we engage a particular event, it will produce a particular action for us. So here we have an example of a JavaScript shell, and we're gonna walk through how can we create this JavaScript shell. So we've already been through a conversation that this is HTML, and you can see up at the top, okay, this is HTML, language is English. We have a head section up at the top. We define our character set. Here we've titled this our JavaScript example. Nothing too fancy there. We do have a style type here for a particular text CSS. Then we have a body section. We've given page, HTML page, a background color. But that's about all we've done there. The main point of focus for us is going to be in this body section. So just like we were talking about before, we're going to define JavaScript, basically a script to read through. In our case, we're going to begin to engage some variables that will help us in a number of things that we're doing. So starting with on the left-hand side there in orange, it says JavaScript. You can see to the right, we're in the body. We've defined header line. This is a JavaScript example. And then the script type, we've defined as text JavaScript. So underneath there, we've highlighted that this is the location for JavaScript code. In this case, you can see that we've put double slashes in front, and that's basically like commenting out code so that it doesn't run. And then reading down, if we get down to basically line or row 27, we are filling some variables there, and this is where our JavaScript code is. So the first one that we take a look at is the variable of number. So we set number equal to 12, and then we set the variable of text equal to data narrativist. So these are two variables we have, both number and text, and we could set them to other values if we wanted to, but this should work for our purposes. And then we'll have our three JavaScript statements here. The console log. So basically, your browser has what's called a console in it. You can think about it as kind of like a temporary storage area for data. And so what we're going to do is these variables will basically capture values, and then we're going to write them out to the console. So the first thing, we'll console log the number, then console log text. So we'll write both of those out to the console, the number and the text that we stored. And then the last one, we'll write out a text statement that inserts both the number and the text variables. So those are the three things that we'll write out to the console log. So similarly, we'll see here, we've defined those variables. So as we discussed, our variables are the number 12, our two variables are number and text. For the number variable, the value is 12. For the variable called text, it's a value of data narrativist. And then we write out these three statements. So those three statements will write out to console. And then the results that we'll see is just like we described. We're going to write out to the console that number 12, because that was our value for number, the number variable. And then we'll write out data narrativist, because that was the value in the text, in the variable named text. And then, as I suggested, we're going to have a statement that inserts both of these variables. And that statement is, I have 12 data narrativists in this class, and it should be fairly obvious what we inserted. We're inserting the 12 in the data narrativists in that sentence. Okay. So this is a good example of how to use variables with JavaScript and write those out to the console. So at this point, let's go. We'll switch over. We'll take a look at our text editor as well as our browser, and we will take a look at how the text works, how JavaScript works, and how it writes out to the console. Okay, so now let's pull over our code example. So this is our JavaScript program. So there's our code we've been discussing. And as a reminder, we're going to have a particular header line in the body. Basically, this is our JavaScript example. We're going to go through scripting. We have two variables. The first one's number, the second one's name. We'll assign the value of 12 to number, and then data narrativist to name. And then in the console log, we'll read out the variable called number, and we'll read out the variable called name. And then we'll read out a particular statement that's inserting the number and the name. Okay, so a couple of things. From here, we then open up a browser. So here we've opened up a browser window. This is our normal browser window. This is Chrome. You'll notice that there's always a Google search there. So this is what we typically see. And then what I've also done is I've right-clicked and I've clicked on Inspect, which turns on each of these functions, and selected Console. And as we described, in our code here, these statements, these JavaScript statements, are going to read out these values to the console. So watch closely when we bring in this code example and execute it, and watch what happens over here in the console. Okay, so here's our title. Data visualization, this is a JavaScript example, so that's what we would see on the screen. Now remember, we had that background color, so this light purple background, that's this definition right here. And then the most valuable part that I want you guys to see is the two variables, number and name, and then we wrote them out to the console as the number value, the name value, and then a sentence using number and name within them. This is what that code produced. So the number is 12, the name is data narrativist, and then it reads out, I have, in this case, 12 data narrativists in this class. And that's what we see reading out here. Now we'd like to talk about defining an array in JavaScript. So it's going to be fairly similar to what we were just working on, but it's going to expand our capabilities just a little bit. So if we start at the top of our HTML code here, we've defined the header in the same way. Then in the body, we're going to do some JavaScript. So we put a title there that says, hey, this is a JavaScript example. We define a script type. And then if we read down a little bit further, we look off to the left there, we have a statement in orange that is defining an array. And so if we come back over to the code, we're going to walk through what that array is. So we see the variable var definition there, and we've defined this variable called array. Now, within array, we're going to place a series of values. So in this case, you see the 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 is an array of values. So array of numeric values there. And then we're going to go back to writing these variable values out to the console. So the first thing we're going to do is just write the whole array out. So everything that's in that array, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, we're just going to write it out. And then we're going to write out one statement at a time, each one of these values in a sentence. So the first one, the value in position 0, that's going to be 100, value in position 1 is 200, etc. through all 5 of those values. Now, some of you guys may be wondering, well, what's going on with this position 0? So in JavaScript, 0 is the first or valid position. That's why we're utilizing the 0 there instead of the 1. So once we do this, when we execute this code, what we're going to find is the example on the top there will be the web page. That's what anyone using a browser would see. If we right click and select the console, we'll see the results in the console. If you recall, the first JavaScript statement we had was basically just read out the whole array. And that's what it did. You see it there, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. And then we went through those statements, 5 different statements. The value in position 0 is 100. The value in position 1 is 200, etc. through the statements. So let's go take a look at that. Okay, so let's bring in our code example for the JavaScript array. So there's our code. So as we were discussing, we've got our header in there. Then in our body, we've got a description of what we're doing here with the scripting. We turn on JavaScript, and then we have our array. So this we're declaring a variable called array, and then we're giving it 5 values, 100, 200, 300, 400, and 500. And then we're going to write out to the console. And so as I was describing before, this is a normal browser window. This happens to be Chrome. And then every browser will have this capability. We're going to select inspect. So I've right-clicked and selected inspect. And then I want to make sure that I've turned on the console element. Okay. And as we discussed before, console is like a temporary data storage area for the browser. So it functions as sort of this temporary storage for whatever data we need to move through the browser in terms of web pages and or applications. So in our case, we're just moving data into web pages, in and out of web pages. So coming back over here to our code example, we're going to write out this array. So we'll expect this to show up when we write this particular statement, console log, write out the variable array, and it should give us all the values in there. And then we're going to write out the value in position 0 is position 0 in the array, the value, we need to make a few adjustments there, I'm seeing. So this should be position 1, position 2, position 3, position 4, and let's save that. So we want to make sure that goes right. So the value in position 1 is position 1 in the array, which will be 200. Value in position 2, so we go to array, position 2 is 300. And if you guys are going, what is this guy talking about or whatever, remember, this is position 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. 4 statements that we're going to write out, okay? All right, so now let's bring in our code example into the browser. So this is the code we just saved. We'll bring it into a browser window and execute it. And you'll see that our header here will come into the web page. This is what would normally be seen by the user of the browser. And then behind the scenes in the console, just like we discussed, we write out the full value of that array. So there's all the values. And then the value in position 0 is 100. The value in position 1 is 200, 2, 300, 3, 400, 4, 500. Okay? So this is how an array works. An array of data works in JavaScript. Okay. Now we're going to talk about defining objects in our JavaScript. So this will just be another set of capabilities that we're going to add to JavaScript. So you'll see up at the top there in the header, we've defined the same way, nothing different there. And we'll come down in the body, you'll see we have a header. This is a JavaScript example. And then we're going to move down and to where we have on the left-hand side a statement saying define an object. So this is what we're going to work on right now. So here we're going to define a particular object. So our variable is called object, and within our curly brackets here, we're going to give this a set of name and value pairs. So you'll see here, name is Jatinder. So name is the name of the particular object, and then Jatinder is the value. Then age is our next object. The value is 35. And then title is the next object, and web developer is the value. Okay, so we've defined our 3 objects here. Okay, now let's go down to write these objects out to console. So first we have console log of object. So basically we need to read object into the console, and then we'll have 3 statements where we're writing these statements out to the console. So console log, the name is, and then we'll use object name, and in this case we expect it to say it's Jatinder. Then console log, he is, and we expect it to fill object age with 35. And then for the third statement there, occupation, we expect to read out as web developer. So basically we have these 3 objects that we've defined, the name value pairs that go with them, and then we can write those out to the console. So this is what we expect the results to be in the JavaScript console. We expect it to read out that particular object. We could open that up, see what's in there, and then our 3 statements are the name is Jatinder, he is 35, and his occupation is web developer. Okay, so let's go take a look at that, this code example, and how we use the object concept in JavaScript. Okay, now let's take a look at our code example for defining JavaScript objects. So we'll bring in our code here. We've defined the header. This is going to be our statement in the web page. We will begin JavaScript. We're going to have different variables, if we'd like, that we can engage here. Primarily, we're going to be focused with our variable object here, which is these three name value pairs. The name with value Jatinder, age 35, title web developer. Then we're going to read this whole object out to the console, and then we're going to read three statements out, what the name is, what the age is, and what the occupation is for Jatinder. Okay, so let's go ahead and run that. I'll bring this into our web page. And so here's our statement. That's what the user would see in the browser. And then you can also see over here in the console, we wrote this object out. So you can see that object right there. So name, Jatinder, age 35, and title web developer. That's what's in our object there. Okay. So we can see that there. And then our three statements. The name is, and we say, okay, add on object name, okay, which would be whatever value's in here, and that's what it did. The name is, and then it took that value of Jatinder, put it right at the end. He is, we said give us the object of age. He is 35. And then his occupation is web developer. Okay, so that's how a simple object works in JavaScript. So that's one. Now we'll move on and work on a little bit larger concept of objects in an array. Okay, now let's talk about defining objects in an array, basically an object array. So now we have a little bit different code example here. We're still in the same type mode where we're doing JavaScript. So this is all a JavaScript example. The main thing that we're changing here is we're just adding multiple sets. Where we had just one particular person, Jatinder, we captured their age and title. Here we're going to capture a bunch of folks. So we're going to create this array of objects. So like it says over on the left, the object array, we're going to define in a variable this array called dataset. You'll notice that we have a set of square brackets that are encasing this whole thing. And then we have our curly brackets for each basically set. So we start off with a name value pair, name Franklin, then age 33, title electrician, close our curly bracket, put a comma, and then we move on to the next, name Saffron, age 27, title web developer, close, comma, open, come back, third one, Freddie, age 41, is project manager, and we put 6 of these in here. Then we'll write it out to the console. So first, we will write the dataset object out to the console, and then we'll go through one by one and say, here are all the names of everyone in this array. So we'll say, you know, the name in position 0 is Franklin, name in position 1 is Saffron, name in position 2 is Freddie, Reese, Robert, and then Maverick. Okay? So when we run that piece of code, the results that we'll find, so first up at the top, that's the web page that anyone in a browser that had visited that page would see. And then behind the scenes in the console, you'll see we have that array will come in, and then our 6 statements that say in this position, this name, Franklin, Saffron, Freddie, Reese, Robert, and Maverick. Okay. Now we can also take a look at the array if we'd like. So we could call that particular array. In this case, it's called data set. So we could just at the prompt there we could type the object array called data set, and then it will return all of those objects that are there. So, and you can see we have, the first object, name, value, pairs, second, third, fourth, etc. Okay, so let's go take a look at this piece of code to see how we're using sort of this array of values in the console using JavaScript. So now let's bring in our code example for defining objects in an array. So here's the code we've been discussing up at the top. Nothing new up there, but the new element that we have added is we've defined this array of objects called data set, and then we have a number of objects, basically object sets within it. So name, value, pairs of name, Franklin, age 33, title, electrician, etc. And then we're going to write some statements out to the console. So first we'll write the whole data set out to the console. Then we'll write each of the names that are in the data set: Franklin, Saffron, Freddie, Reese, Robert, and Maverick, all out with their relative positions there. Okay, so let's get our console going again so we can see both sides working, sort of what's on the screen and what's happening behind the scenes. We'll bring in our code example. We see the statement that we've defined there. So data visualization, JavaScript object example, that's what will be seen on screen. And then behind the scenes, we see, okay, we brought in a data set there. And so we can take a look at each of those objects and we'll see those name value pairs for each of these object sets. Okay. And then we decided we'd write out the names for each of the positions. So we wrote out in position 0, the 0 set, Franklin, the 1 set, Saffron, 2 set, Freddie, etc. That we've read all those out. And I think I mentioned as well before that we could simply call our object and it will bring them all out there. Okay, so we have that capability to call our particular object if we wish. Okay, so now we want to take a look at D3 using SVG components. So the first thing we'll take a look at is defining our D3 library. So here where we have listed off to the left in orange the D3 library, if we look over to the right, and we'll see script type equals text JavaScript, and then source will define the D3 library there. So basic URL for where that class of D3 statements exists. And then reading further down, we'll see we've defined in the body, we've defined that purple background color. Then we've also defined our SVG canvas as white, so you'll see that as well. So if you recall, one of the first statements that we make when we're using SVG is how large our canvas or drawing space is going to be. So we'll see that highlighted in white. Then coming down to the body, we'll start defining different SVG objects. So the first one is our canvas. So for SVG, we want it to be 600 wide and 200 high. So that will be our canvas. Then we'll draw a line. And remember that when we draw a line, we'll start with a particular XY coordinate. So in this case, it's 1010. And then the second XY endpoint coordinate is 190, 190. And then we're going to make it an orange line, which we define by making stroke, which is another term for create a line, orange. And then we'll define how wide we want that particular line to be. Then we'll create our second line, which is a green line. We'll start where the orange line ends and go up with it. Then we'll define a rectangle. So with our rectangle, we have to give it a particular coordinate on X. So we're going to read over a ways toward the center of the canvas with a value of 200, so about a third of the way. Then we're going to come down a little bit, so about 10 from the top. And we're going to make this particular rectangle with a width of 100, a height of 100. So basically we're making a square. And then we'll fill with the color red. Then we'll create a circle. So the next row down, we'll create a circle. We're going to have to give it a particular X and Y coordinate to start at. So we're going to move this one further over from the square, as well as further down so we can see it. And then we're going to give it a radius of 50 and fill of blue. And if you'll notice, basically the width of the square as well as the circle will be the same. It's just a different way to express the same width. And then we'll have a text statement. We'll have a starting position of 200 on the X, 100 on the Y. We'll fill it with colored charcoal. So basically we're going to make some dark gray or black text. We'll give it a font size. We're going to put it in bold. We'll give it a font of Helvetica. And then we'll tell it this is what we want it to be. D3 objects next is the statement we want to put there, or the text that we want to put there. Okay, so then we'll close out the SVG. We'll close out the script for JavaScript, and we'll see how this works. What we can expect to see here is we're using D3 to select these SVG objects. So we're going to type a statement, D3.select rectangle, and from there we can take a look at that particular rectangle, see what different elements it has. So here we can go and inspect the elements. So instead of the console, we simply go to elements. If we look at the rectangle there, it's just to the right of where we say review rectangle. We'll see in purple the rectangle. We can take a look at those coordinates and sort of compare them to what we see there with the red rectangle. The X position, you can see we've read over about a third before we start. The Y is about 10 down on the canvas. So that's why you see that little sort of bit of white space or bar above the red square or red rectangle. We fill it with red, and so we can see what those elements are, SVG elements are, by selecting elements and taking a look at them. And we can also change the rectangle attributes. So if we'd like, we can go in and change the width. So here we'll select D3, select our rectangle, and we'll change the attribute of width. So .attr is the attribute. We'll select the width, and this time, instead of 100, We'll give it a width of 340, and it will change our red square into a red rectangle. So let's go ahead and take a look at that and take a look at how these SVG objects work. Now we'll bring in our D3 with SVG code. So as we walk through, we've defined the D3 library here. We've defined the purple background as well as the canvas for SVG as being white, and that'll help us see the difference between the background of the page and the SVG canvas. And then we'll come into the body and we will define SVG. Here's our canvas, a width of 600, a height of 200, and then each of our objects, the orange line, the green line, red rectangle, the blue circle, and our black text here. Okay. All right, so let's bring that into our web browser here. Let's go ahead and turn on our inspection. I'm going to leave it right where it is because we're going to want to inspect some of these elements. And we'll bring in this set of code and run it in our particular page here. So we see that this is run. We see our purple background, then our SVG canvas that we've drawn here in white, and then our SVG canvas is 600 wide, is 200 down. Then our line. So our line begins at the X and Y position of 10, and you'll notice it's down a little bit from the top corner of the SVG canvas. We give it an endpoint of 190, 190. So there's our orange line being drawn. We start our green line at that same 190, 190 position, and then we take it to the 400, 0 position, and notice it goes all the way to the top of the canvas versus being down 10. It's of course green. Then we create our red rectangle. So the X is on the 200, so we come over 200, and remember this was 190, so you can see it's over a little bit from that. That's 200, and also down 10, so the same 10 down, and then it's 100 by 100 is our definition. We fill it with red. Then our circle on the X position is 300. The Y, so here's our X position over 300. And remember, this was 200 and 190, so we're over 300. And then the Y is down 140. And of course, we have a radius of 50. And so if we have a radius of 50, and a 50 is the same thing as a width of 100. And then we'll fill this with blue. And then we'll have text, the X at 200. So if you'll recall, we started the rectangle at 200 as well. So you'll see the text start there. Then the Y is down 100. So it's basically at the halfway point of the overall height is at 100. So we'd be pretty much right in the center of our overall canvas here. We want it to be charcoal, which is basically another name for black. Font size of 42, and we want it to be in bold, Helvetica, and here's what we want it to say, D3 objects next. And so when we brought this code example in here, that's what we were able to see. So we can open up our SVG objects. We can compare. Of course, they ran. Particularly, we can take a look at our rectangle here is exactly the same elements that we have. And then we can take a look at our console. So with our console, we can select particular objects. So here we'll go ahead and select our rectangle. So we have D3 dot select. So you see the select statement popping up there. And I want to select, in particular, my rectangle, whatever I've defined for rectangle. And this is what we see there. These are all the instructions that D3 has provided to create that particular rectangle. Now I could also make some adjustments if I wanted to. So I can say D3 select, and I want to select the rectangle. And I specifically want to select an attribute of that rectangle called width. And I want to make it something different. If you will recall, we had it as 100. And here, I want to make it larger so that it's fully forming a background on our text statement. And so there it goes. It took it from 100 wide to 340 wide, and of course is now a background for our D3 objects next. Now, this approach, the way that you just saw D3 working, is sort of this dynamic capability of D3 that makes it so useful and so powerful, because on the fly, we can set different variables and different objects to be adjusting with different JavaScript events, so that when we rescale a window or we make some other type of event happen, someone clicks on something, D3 automatically adjusts the SVG objects appropriately. Okay, so now we're going to look at loading a CSV file with D3. So as you guys all know, CSV files are very common. It's a comma-separated value data file. It's basically just sort of like, a very simple text flat file. We're going to load that in using a particular statement in D3. We're going to load it into an array. So just like we were working with before, where we had an array of different developers' names and ages, we're going to read this data file in as an array as well. So maybe some sort of, new things to see or whatever. It's basically a statement. So we're scripting. Of course, we're in JavaScript. And then we're going to have, we've already brought in that D3 library and defined it. So now we can use it. And we're going to have a statement that is called d3.csv. And basically, CSV is a statement in D3 that knows, hey, I need to bring in a file. So we will tell it, here is your file name that you're looking for. Here is a particular function. We're going to call this array data. And then in the console, we're going to read that particular array back out to the console. Now, just as a reminder, you want to make sure to change the URL when you run this particular piece of code to localhost for your directory. This is where we're going to start using WAMP and MAMP so that we have our own little personal web server, and we will need to make sure that we're using our local host directory. Okay, so let's go take a look at it. Okay, so now we'll bring in our D3 code that will load our file. So here's our statement. It's going to access this library. We'll pick up that CSV statement, that function in D3 that will load this particular file for us. You want to make sure in your local host directory that this web page and your CSV file is in the same directory, because it's going to look for it in the same directory that this page is running in. So we can go ahead, we'll turn on our console side by side there. We'll bring in this page, and what's going on here is it's looking for it in the local host directory. So we'll type that, and there it goes. And if we open up, we can see all of those objects, all of those data elements that are part of the array that was in the food court CSV file that we just loaded. So we've now loaded this data file, all of its contents, into the console in the browser. And now finally, we'll show you guys a way to load these files that you've just created. So you've just created this piece of code as well as your CSV file. We'll show you a way to store that on GitHub. So we'll go out to GitHub gist. We'll rename that particular HTML page to index. And then once we've done that, we can simply drag over that file as well as our data file, and it will save it for us in GitHub. When we drag those over, so from our directory, you can see on the right-hand side there, we have both the piece of code we've renamed index as well as the food court data file. We drag it over to the GitHub gist, and then it will bring in both the HTML code and record that, and then it will also bring in the data file. And so the code and the data record are saved for us. We can then save to blocks.org, so it's bl.ocks.org, and it's very simple. We just change the URL to blocks.org, and it will save it to our name there in blocks.org. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at that. Okay, so in order to save this to GitHub, we will first rename this to index. That's a requirement of saving. And then we can simply take our two files, select those, drag them over, and it is now captured. There's our data file. And it looks like, I'm not sure it got our index there. go. Okay, and once we've brought over both of our files, we can then rename this and it will have saved that on blocks.org. So in summary, HTML is the code page framework that we're going to be working in for all these different libraries. The CSS style sheet can apply different styles, colors, fonts for our text or other objects. SVG is going to be our shapes library. So our lines, our rectangles, our circles, our text is all available in the SVG library. We're going to use JavaScript to trigger different things based on events. So we may change things when folks push on a button, and JavaScript is going to do our work moving our data into the console. Then the D3 library is going to be a set of commands. We used it today to load a data set. We used one of the commands in D3 to load a data set into the console. But we're going to be using it in the future to engage some of the shapes from SVG, and D3 will tell SVG how to draw that particular shape, and then also how to rescale it when different events change. And then finally, we use GitHub to save our code, our HTML page, our code, that data loading, as well as the data set. This concludes the lecture on web-based visualization.